Then we also had the article in the Michigan Citizen. I didn't have the actual paper with me, but the banks get paid while Detroiters lose, which focuses on the city of Detroit, and it talks about the march at the U.S. Social Forum as well, the march on Chase Bank. But in that article, we revealed that the city has something like a $6 billion debt, $8.6 billion in total long-term debt obligations as of 2009, along with $1.5 billion in pension obligation certificates. Now, the pension obligation certificates was a deal that was concocted, I think, in 2006 during the Kilpatrick administration. There was massive opposition to it on the council, which finally backed down, as they usually do, and okayed it, because people said, what happens if the city defaults on this? And, in fact, the city defaulted on it last year in 2009. And they were about the creditors who are, let's see if I can find their names in here. Anyway, the creditors, they're farther down here, I'll come to them. But they were about to call in that debt with a $1.5 billion debt from the city. That would have completely, the city of Detroit might as well have been in a nuclear meltdown from the Monroe power plant if that had happened. So what the city did instead was they negotiated, and they said how great this was that Mayor Cockrell at the time had somebody there with Auditor General Joe Harris that could negotiate this deal, that all the money coming from the casinos would go first to pay off the debts for the pension obligation certificates. And they also have now negotiated that all the city's debt payments, that they go first to the city's revenue sharing payments from the state are obligated to the debt payments to the banks. And that's just for 2010 alone. The debt payments that I found were $220 million, with $120 million of it in interest. It's probably more than that, because I don't think that takes into account the enterprise funds like the water department. So it's outrageous. And this is the situation with cities across the country. Cities and school districts. Detroit is probably the worst. Detroit is ground zero, as Jesse Jackson said at the press conference at the UAW. And we do have an article on that in this Michigan Citizen. UAW and Rainbow Push had, which I thought was extremely significant. And I think it's probably the UAW really pushing. Bob King is the one really pushing for the more militant action, because I noticed that on the UAW website that they had a picture of the march at the U.S. Social Forum. And but you couldn't find anything on the Rainbow Push website about this whole coalition. So it's significant that they're calling, and they were strongly, the speakers at the press conference were strongly opposed to the banks, strongly calling on people to march on the banks, to stop what the banks are doing to this country. And of course, you know that this is not the first time the idea of a debt moratorium has been raised in this world. It's been raised across the third world since the 80s at least, the 70s maybe, yeah. At least. Cuba has definitely has called on all third world countries to declare a moratorium on their debt to the banks. The Jubilee campaign, all sorts of countries have actually either done it or done it in a partial fashion. And it's also happened before here in Detroit in the 1930s. Mayor Frank Murphy, because the city was in such destitute situation at that time, that he called for a moratorium on debt to the banks. It turned into legislation that was backed by a state representative, let's see, Richard Flanagan, who asked for a 10-year moratorium on debt to the banks. I don't think it eventually was able to go anyplace. They hurried up and got Frank Murphy into office as governor, and then they sent him to the Philippines as the ambassador to the Philippines.
Okay, at least they didn't murder
But it was raised, and it was and he called on the courts to legitimize it. He called on the U.S. Congress to legitimize it. So, and I'm researching now to see if actually there's an article out there from the Huffington Post too that kind of, while talking about moratoriums on debts to foreclosures, they're very closely linked because it's all a moratorium on debts. You know, this is just a moratorium on the government's debts, the city's debts, the schools' debts, the banks' debts, the state's debts, because the state is involved in this too, although they're the culprit in a lot of this. They're also borrowing money from the same financial authority now. It was the Michigan Municipal Bond Authority, but now it's under the Michigan Finance Authority, and the state is borrowing money from them and likely under the same terms. So what I'm suggesting I know that the moratorium on foreclosures campaign itself is a huge undertaking, but at some point we need to start focusing also on raising a campaign for a moratorium on debt to the banks from the cities, the states, the school districts, every government in this country that is, especially the major cities, the urban, the poorest, and cities with the majority black and Latino populations are the ones that are really being slaughtered by this debt. So I just wanted to suggest that, and all the articles I referenced are over there. Actually, even Vernero raised about taking out $1 billion out of Chase Bank from Chase Bank because of Chase Bank's redlining, and giving that over to community banks and credit. I think the last article was the one from the Huffington Post. It's just the reason I'm raising those is that it's becoming a more broadly accepted type of concept right now, and people are enraged about the banks. They know what they're doing to them. You don't have to tell them what the banks are doing to this country, and I think it's time. You know, the third world, this is a third world city. And the third world across the country has been raising this for decades now and doing it. And, then you have the whole crisis going on right now across the world that's caused by Greece's default on its debt. Countries all over the world, there's a whole long article on Iceland that the only solution for that country is a moratorium on its debt to the banks. And 27 countries across the world, it mentions, that are trying to declare a moratorium on debt to the banks. Though that, of course, relates a lot to the International Monetary Fund, which is controlled by U.S. banks. But it's a global economy, so it's controlled by banks, globally. So anyway, I don't have specific suggestions right now as to how to raise this campaign, but I think we need to. I've been raising it in the articles that I've written, and at some point we need to do some sort of tactical approach to that. And Detroit can lead the way, because I believe Detroit is the worst hurt in the country by the situation. Anytime you got a school district that's paying 90 cents out of every school aid dollar to the banks.
That's ridiculous.
That is the tipping point. That is insane.
Back during the spring, we did put out a leaflet when the school closings were announced that did focus on the role of the banks in crippling the Detroit public school system as well as the city of Detroit. And that's very important. Also, the leaflet for this meeting, too, also had a list of departments and their obligations to the banks in terms of debt service, because I think that's very important for people to emphasize, because a lot of the people who are talking about the crisis in the city and in the schools don't even mention the role of the banks in this whole crisis, at all. They don't mention the role of the state, nor do they mention the role of the financial institutions. And I think possibly we could put out another leaflet to circulate at some of these city council meetings, as well as when the schools open back up in September, to circulate them there as well. I know there's a plan for a National Day of Action around education on October the 7th. And we could utilize that leaflet as a mechanism of building that national action.